Now my pleasure.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the 2019 Lymphoma Research Foundation Ed Forum. We are coming to you from Chicago, Illinois. Now if you missed any of our previous events, you can check them out by clicking on the videos tab on our Facebook page. Our next chat is about to get underway where they'll be discussing immunotherapy as a treatment option for lymphoma. Let's head inside.
How it works. A little bit then about the nuts and bolts of the immune system. Few minutes, how it recognizes cancer cells and kills them. I'll talk about an interesting pathway or a number of pathways that cancers use to sort of escape the immune responses that our bodies make against them. And we'll talk briefly about the different types of cancer immunotherapy. And then I'll talk specifically about the clinical results of a couple of different immunotherapies for lymphoma. And then Elizabeth, who's going to follow, is going to talk about CAR T-cell therapy. And so, our immune systems initially evolved to help provide protection against viruses and bacteria. We know that cells of our immune system are actually created in the bone marrow from the same stem cells that make our red blood cells and platelet cells. The immune system, it consists of cells and proteins, really, whose purpose it is to recognize and kill microorganisms. Again, bacteria, viruses, fungi. Now, interestingly, our immune systems are educated to recognize and attack foreign invaders, but at the same time, they leave our healthy cells and tissues alone. And how this happens is kind of complicated, but I think it's very fascinating. In some contexts, or in some cases, the immune system can actually recognize and kill cancer cells, which is how immunotherapy has evolved. And the immune system consists of two main branches. We have the innate immune system, and these are the cells that initially respond to an infection. And then we have the adaptive immune system, and these are cells like B cells and T cells that I'll talk more about in a moment that really provide a tailored attack against a particular bacteria or virus. And these are also the cells, particularly T cells, that can recognize cancer cells as being a little bit abnormal and make a response against them. As I mentioned, immune cells all develop in the bone marrow, and they're essentially white blood cells, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And on the left are the innate immune cells, and these include cells like neutrophils, macrophages, dendritic cells, natural killer cells. And on the right are the adaptive immune cells, including T cells and B cells. Now, B cells make antibodies, which are very important in recognizing and preventing bacterial infections. Whereas T cells, they sort of survey our bodies, and particularly our cells, for evidence that they've become transformed into cancer cells or been infected with viruses. And how they do that, I'm going to talk about briefly in just a moment. Now, the cells that are important, the immune cells that are important in the anti-tumor or anti-lymphoma immune response, I've highlighted, and I'm going to tell you quick stories about each of those, but on the left are the macrophages. These are cells, again, of the innate immune system, as well as T cells on the right. And so, how T cells recognize their targets. T cells are the main drivers of the anti-tumor response. These are the cells in our immune system that actually kill cancer cells for the most part. And how they do this is in the context, for example, of an infected cell. That virus or that bacteria has proteins which are degraded by the cell, which are chopped up into small fragments called peptides. And those peptides are then loaded onto the, as you can see, the class 1 or class 2 MHC molecules. And these are basically proteins that help display these peptides that come from bacteria or viruses. And then we have T cells. On the left is a cytotoxic T cell, and on the right is a helper T cell. And these are the main two types of T cells in the body. And they recognize their targets a little bit differently, and they have a little bit different functions in the immune system. But this is sort of how the process works. They recognize parts of proteins, either from bacteria or from a virus, or in the case of a cancer cell, an abnormal protein that a cancer cell makes, as being a little bit abnormal or a little bit foreign. And when that happens, the T cell becomes activated. It divides, it makes some proteins that kill the target cell, and then it moves on to the next cell. And so how are cancer cells, which are derived from our normal tissues, seen as abnormal by T cells of the immune system? Well, on the top, this is sort of a cartoon depicting the situation in a normal cell. Normal cell has normal proteins. Those normal proteins get broken down and loaded onto those yellow MHC, or major histocompatibility complex molecules. T cells see those peptides as very normal. They don't make an immune response because they're normal proteins. But in the case of a cancer protein, sometimes these proteins are mutated or abnormally expressed. There's too much of them. And that's the context when a T cell can recognize the fragments of those proteins in those MHC molecules and say, hey, this isn't quite right. It's time for me to make a response. Now, even though we know that cancers express targets or antigens that are recognizable to cells of our immune system, tumors are no dummies. They activate many, many pathways, and the specifics I don't think are important, but once a T cell enters into the lymphoma environment, for example, or any tumor environment, it faces a harsh uphill battle, The tumor environment is very unformidable to T cells and other immune cells. The tumor cells themselves produce factors that shut down T cell function or cause them to die. The tumor recruits other cells into its environment that shut down the function of T cells. So even though our immune systems in some cases make responses against the cancer in response to that shuts down the function of the immune response. And this is exactly the way that many immunotherapies work, by shutting down some of these inhibitory pathways. And so I'll talk about probably the most important pathway in cancer immunology and immunotherapy, and it's called the PD1 or Program Death 1, Program Death Ligand 1 axis. And the identification of this receptor called PD1, which you can see on the surface of that green T cell, was the subject of the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 2018. So the person who discovered this receptor on T cells won the Nobel Prize last year for it, because it's really led to revolutionary advancements in the way that we use immunotherapy to treat cancer. And so how this pathway works is, you can see that T cell on the left recognizes the cancer cell or the tumor cell on the right through its receptor called the T cell receptor in the context of that antigen MHC molecule. When that recognition happens, the T cell becomes activated and makes some cytokines, and you can see one important one called IFN gamma or interferon gamma. That cytokine stimulates the tumor cell to upregulate a receptor or a ligand called PD-L1. Meanwhile, the tumor cell upregulates its receptor, and when you see the interaction between PD-1 and PD-L1 happening, that tells the T cell to shut down its function, to stop killing, to stop making effector molecules. And so, because of this discovery and others, including CAR T-cell therapy, cancer immunotherapy was considered the breakthrough of the year in the journal Science, which is a huge scientific journal. Cancer immunotherapy has been around for a long time, but really around this time was the first evidence that using the immune system to fight cancer actually worked in patients. And so in the context of lymphoma, we have a few different types of immunotherapy. In the 1990s and early 2000s, we had vaccines, or cancer vaccines. Many of you have heard of these. And in lymphoma in particular, we had anti-idiotype vaccines. And these were effective in some patients, but haven't really been effective enough to gain approval for use in most patients. And then we have adoptive T-cell therapy. This is where we take T cells, either from tumors or from our bloodstreams, and infuse them back into patients. And in lymphoma, this often takes the shape of CAR T-cell therapy, which you're going to hear much more about in a moment, so I won't belabor that. And then we have what's called immune checkpoint blockade therapy, and this is really a therapy that's effective not only in lymphomas, but in many, many other cancers. And so we have PD1 blockade therapy, and these are really therapies that interrupt interactions between the PD1 receptor and its ligand on tumor cells that I just told you about. And then another type of blockade therapy that's kind of newer and involves macrophages is called CD47 blockade therapy. And so these are called checkpoint pathways. And what happens in the context of, again, recognizing a tumor cell A T cell upregulates receptors called PD1, again, interacts with PD-L1 on the tumor cell, and again, that shuts down the function of the T cell. If we can use antibodies, shown here, I don't know if you can see my arrow or not, on the left, to interrupt those interactions, we can restore the function of those T cells, and now they become better killers of tumor cells. And so these are what we call waterfall plots of PD-1 blockade therapy. Again, these are antibodies that block interactions between PD-1 and PD-L1 in cancer patients. And you can see all the different types of cancer that these antibodies have been tested in: melanoma, lung cancer, head and neck cancer, bladder cancer, gastric cancer. And you can see that the green bars are how much the tumor has either grown or decreased in size after treatment. So the ones that are below the bar, the patients that have responded. And what we can see is that there are two types of lymphoma, namely classical Hodgkin lymphoma and an uncommon type of aggressive large B-cell lymphoma called mediastinal B-cell lymphoma, that respond extraordinarily well to PD-1 blockade therapy. And it's been approved for use in both of these lymphomas. But the point I want to make here is that PD-1 blockade therapy is not just effective in lymphoma, it's approved for many, many other types of cancers as well. And these were some of the initial data that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago about the activity of PD-1 blockade therapy in patients who have Hodgkin or who had Hodgkin lymphoma that had been treated with a number of other previous treatments. And this was a small study, although there have been many other larger studies that have confirmed the exciting findings. 23 patients, 80% of them had been through a prior stem cell transplant, and 80% had also received another very effective therapy called brentuximab vedotin. Some of you may have heard of this. So again, a very heavily treated patient population. The response rate, meaning the number of patients or the fraction of patients that had shrinkage of their tumors, was almost 90%, and almost 20% of those responses were complete. Almost 90% of the patients that had a response remained in remission 6 months later. And so these are just some of the plots that show the duration of responses above, and you can see, this is called a swimmer's plot. You can see that patients who had responses to these medicines, or this medicine, many of these responses were long-lasting. Now, Hodgkin lymphoma is somewhat rare, but mediastinal lymphoma, I would argue, is even rarer. This is an aggressive large B-cell lymphoma that typically occurs in younger patients. It's often cured with chemotherapy, but when it's not, it's been quite difficult to eradicate. And so it also has features that are quite similar to Hodgkin lymphoma. And so there were phase 1 and phase 2 studies of another PD-1 blocking antibody here called pembrolizumab. And these were the Keynote 13 and 170 studies, not important for you to remember. But these were early studies of this anti-PD-1 antibody in mediastinal lymphoma. And here about 45% of patients had responses, so not quite as high as Hodgkin lymphoma. The complete response rate, meaning the percentage of patients whose tumors went completely away, was a little bit higher, however. And no patient who had a complete response, and we have pretty long follow-up now, had a recurrence. So if you're a patient with mediastinal lymphoma that's come back, you receive this treatment and are fortunate enough to have a complete response, those responses are very durable. And this may even cure some patients, which is pretty remarkable. And here again are the plots showing the degree of tumor shrinkage across patients. And so that's the first story, PD-1 blockade therapy, remarkably effective in Hodgkin lymphoma and primary mediastinal lymphoma. It's also been tested in many other lymphoma types, and the effectiveness has been somewhat mixed. And I think what we need to do there is identify subsets of patients who might be more likely to benefit. The nice thing about these therapies as well is that they're generally well tolerated. Most patients don't have severe side effects. They're easy to give. They can be given in the office. They're given every 3 to 4 weeks. So it's, I think it's in the right context, it's a very good therapy to use. And the second and final story I'm going to tell you about is a newer story about macrophages. And remember, these are the innate immune cells, and their job in our bodies is really to eat. They eat infected cells, they eat dead and dying cells. They're sort of the garbage trucks, if you will, of the immune system. Turns out they can also eat cancer cells because they can also, like T cells, sense cancer cells as being a little bit abnormal. They do so in a completely different way than T cells, and by the way, they don't look like Pac-Man, just FYI. So it turns out that macrophages eat cancer cells, but cancer cells activate pathways to prevent that. And so what they do, you can see the tumor cell on the, I guess that would be your right there, has very high expression of a protein on the surface of its cell called CD47. CD47, when it binds or when it's stuck to its partner called SIRP-alpha on macrophages, and again, I don't think the specifics are important, but this signal, this interaction tells the macrophage, don't eat that cell. And so tumor cells basically evade their own demise, if you will, by overexpressing a protein that tells macrophages not to eat them. Now, cancer cells also express proteins that activate phagocytosis, and so the decision of a macrophage to eat or to not eat a cancer cell is really a balance of eat me and don't eat me signals it receives. Turns out that if you interrupt or block interactions where that red X is between CD47 and SIRP-alpha, again, most commonly with antibodies, that now allows the macrophage to say, all right, this is a cell that I can eat. Simple as that. And when you also provide a stimulus for phagocytosis, and rituximab, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is an excellent stimulus for phagocytosis by macrophages, you have a ragingly positive clinical trial in patients with relapsed and refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and follicular lymphoma, simply by administering antibodies, the first one being rituximab, and that is a stimulator of phagocytosis, and a second antibody called an anti-CD47 antibody or a CD47 blocking antibody. You get response rates, meaning again fractions of patients whose tumors shrink, of upwards of 50%. Most of those responses were complete. And in patients with large B-cell lymphoma, you can see the objective response rate is 40%. And this is in patients who've had on the average of at least 4 different treatments before. And so these are well-tolerated treatments, again, fairly simple to administer, relatively well-tolerated. And this is just an example of a patient's PET scan before and after treatment. You can see all those dark areas on the left at the baseline scan, and this is before this patient received treatment. And then the same PET scan that was taken after the treatment. So simply by manipulating the immune system, either by blocking PD1, PD-L1 interactions with antibodies, or CD47 SIRP-alpha interactions with antibodies, you can have notoriously and ragingly positive activity in patients with otherwise, I would say, limited treatment options. And so I'll finish up here. I hope I've convinced you that the immune cell's job is to recognize and kill cancer cells, at least some of the time. We know that cancer cells can express antigens or targets that are seen as foreign to T cells of our immune systems. And although some of us generate good immune responses against our lymphomas, sometimes they're suppressed once they get into the lymphoma environment. We talked about the main types of immunotherapy, including CAR T-cell therapy, which Elizabeth will tell you much more about, PD1 blockade therapy, as well as CD47 blockade therapy. PD1 blockade therapy works very well in Hodgkin lymphoma and mediastinal lymphoma. It's very easy to administer, relatively safe, and it's now FDA approved for both. CD47 blockade therapy seems to work well in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and follicular lymphoma, and there may be other lymphomas where this is active. This is a newer treatment. It's not yet approved, but it's in clinical trials now. And not only in lymphoma, but across human cancer, immunotherapy has completely revolutionized the way that we treat cancer. We're using much less chemotherapy now, much more immunotherapy, and I'm sure there's going to be much more to come in the future. So I'll stop there, and I don't know if we're going to do questions now or at the end, but I thanks for your attention.
getting my steps in today. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, and I did just mention to Dr. Kline we'll hold all questions to the end, so both of our speakers can answer your questions together. And I think while they arrange our next slide, I'd like to ask Dr. Elizabeth Budde from the Department of Hematology and Stem Cell Transplantation at the Beckman Research Institute at the City of Hope National Medical Center to now join me at the podium for the second half of our immunotherapy presentation.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Lymphoma Research Foundation for giving me this opportunity to be here to talk about what I know about immunotherapy with a focus on CAR T-cell therapy. So here are my disclosures. So I want to begin my talk first to introduce the concept of cancer immunity cycle. So this is really a high-level, very simplified view in a normal healthy person. So what's happening? If you look at, you can see that step one, which is in the bottom, is at any given time, we all have cancer cells. Cancer cells are, they are not that special. They're just cells that somehow pick up some mutations. They have dysregulated cell cycles. Therefore, they can continue to divide and proliferate. And our body, as Dr. Kline mentioned earlier, has a way to really sense the antigens that are produced by these cancer cells. And when the body has professional, what we call APC cells, they can pick up this antigen and they will take this antigen to the lymphatic system, such as the lymph nodes or lymphoid tissues, and therefore they present this antigen to T cells, which are the immune killer cells. The immune killer cells, then they are educated, they are activated and proliferate, become the cancer-specific T cells. And these T cells will then travel through the bloodstream from the lymphatic system and go into and infiltrate into the cancer or tumor cells. And therefore, these T cells will be able to get rid of those cancer cells before they become a problem, and your body will maintain in this healthy state. But what happens if there is your immune system failed to recognize these cancer cells? So we can see here is, here highlights a few scenarios that the immune system are not able to recognize cancer cells. In the first one to the far left is the one that you do have a lot of T cells and a lot of cancer cells or tumor cells. They cohabit, but these T cells they are not cancer specific. They don't have the power or the glasses to see the tumor cells. So therefore, the tumor continues to grow. And the one in the middle is you do have tumor-specific T cells, but they're really deficient in number. You don't have enough of them to get around and get rid of all the tumor cells, and therefore the cancer will develop. The third scenario is a scenario that you have enough cancer-specific T cells, but they are so tired, they're exhausted, they have so much job to do, so they can't finish it. They get tired and then they give up, they become allergic. So how to get around this? So for cancer cells, they don't just sit there, so they continue to evolve, continue to proliferate. They constantly trying to find ways really to disable and to evade the immune system, find out the loopholes. And the goal of our immunotherapy is really to be able to restore the capacity of the immune system and to hone the power of the immune system to really recognize and eliminate cancer cells. So for successful immunotherapy, we really need to get rid of all the layers surrounding protecting the tumor cells and be able to get to the center over here to get rid of the tumor. So then the question is, what are the CAR Ts? So I'm going to show you here in a very brief way the history of immunotherapy in clinical oncology. So back in the 80s, we started to give patients IL-2, interferon alpha, which are cytokines non-specifically to stimulate your immune system. A small percentage of patients with renal cell carcinoma, melanoma, are able to go into a complete remission based on this treatment. And later on, we have a little bit more specific way to activate the immune system using the PD1 blockade. For example, pembrolizumab nivolumab, which was approved in 2011 for patients with Hodgkin lymphoma. And back in the 1990s, rituximab became the first monoclonal antibody that received FDA approval for patients with CD20 positive lymphoma. And subsequently, we have other antibodies that are approved for cancer treatment. One is now brentuximab for T-cell lymphoma and Hodgkin lymphoma. Vaccine has always been a very interesting research area of study, and it has beautiful results in animal study, but in clinical trials and in practice, there's only one vaccine approved so far for prostate cancer, but there are a lot of researchers that are actually working on how to make vaccine works for lymphoma. And fast forward to 2010, finally, we have CAR T-cells in the clinic, and initially starting from clinical trials, and until 2017, more and more clinical trials demonstrated CD19 CAR Ts are effective. So in 2017, KTE-091, which is now called Yescarta, is approved for patients with aggressive diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And in May 2018, CTL-019, which is now called Kymriah, is approved. And there are also other types of cell-based therapies, such as the T-cell engager therapies, using bispecific antibodies. One example is blinatumomab, which is a CD19 targeting antibodies, which recruits the T-cells inside the patient. That was actually approved for a patient with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So then what are the CARs and what are CAR T-cells? So CAR represents a chimeric antigen receptor, and CAR is actually a protein expressed on the surface of cells that contains two parts. It has extracellular part, so outside expressed on the membrane of the cells, and it's outside the membrane part can recognize a specific target, a target protein on the tumor cells. And inside the cells, that part inside of the CAR is actually mediates, is switched on, tells the cells to activate, to exert their cytolytic activities. And the differences between CARs really lies both on the outside part and the inside part. And CAR T-cells are T-cells that are genetically modified to express CAR protein on their surface. And here's a cartoon to show you how CAR T-cell works. And one highlight of CAR T-cells that is different than other treatment is really it's a living drug. It can expand inside the body once the condition is right. So basically, take a regular, ordinary T-cells, which really cannot recognize tumor cells. Therefore, the tumor cells are pretty happy over there, can see the happy face. But once we transform these ordinary T-cells into a super T-cell, so we put CAR on the surface of these T-cells, they become supercharged. So they are very pissed off. They are very charged. They are very. They start to work. When they recognize the tumor cells, they start to eliminate the tumor cells. At the same time, they clone themselves. They it can multiply 1,000-fold inside the patient and to get the job done. And here's the process how we do CAR-based T-cell therapy. Usually we start with a patient with tumor. We collect blood cells from this patient either through a leukapheresis or just by blood draw. And once we get the immune cells, we activate them in the lab. We educate them by using a viral-specific transduction approach to make CAR T-cell, to make CAR express on the surface. When we change the ordinary T-cell into a super T-cell, CAR T-cells, this CAR T-cell then expand to a sufficient number, and this process takes around 17 to 22 days at present time. And once the cells are ready, the patient typically will undergo lymphodepletion. And the goal of lymphodepletion, one is to debulk, and more is to make sure that the patient, the host, creates environment that welcoming to the CAR T cells. Once the CAR T cell infused, the body will be able to accept them, so T cell will engraft, and then they begin to survey around the body to get rid of the tumor cells. And once T cells are infused, that's also when the acute toxicities, complication could happen. Therefore, at least this patient will be closely monitored for at least 8 weeks, either in the hospital or in the outpatient clinic setting. And here's the landscape of CAR T cells. So these, I accessed these data in clinicaltrial.gov back in the end of June. You can see there's already more than 800 clinical trials using CAR Ts for different cancers. And the most common ones are the ones that are designed for lymphoma. You can see 3 major sites, the US, China, and Europeans, are really working hard to design and to identify novel CAR T-cell therapies for different types of lymphoma. And this is really based on the observations that what we learned from targeting CD19, a B-cell lymphoma marker, that in aggressive B-cell lymphoma, I listed 3 multi-center clinical trials here. What is the ZUMA-1, and the second one in the middle is Juliet. The third one is Transcend. So all these 3 clinical trials have already completed accrual, and ZUMA-1 and Juliet study has been already published. Transcend studies, we're still waiting for the final report. But as you can see here, these studies, they have a little bit different patient enrollment criteria, a little bit different criteria how they score CRs and when to detect the response. So you cannot necessarily compare the data side by side. But I want to show you here is, if you look at the survival curve, you can see there's actually a plateauing. For patients on ZUMA-1, the best complete response rate is 58%. And if patients pass 9 months, most of them continue to respond. And at the end of 27 months, there's a median follow-up from CAR T infusion. 35% of them still in remission. And for patients on the Juliet clinical trial, median follow-up 19 months, 37% of patients remains in complete remission. So these remissions are quite durable. And patients on Transcend study also gave us a similar trend. And based on the results from Juliet and ZUMA-1 studies, those are the pivotal trials that led to the FDA approval of Yescarta for aggressive B-cell lymphoma, also for patients with primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma in October 2017. And Kline was approved in May 2018 for similar populations, but it does not include patients with primary B-cell lymphoma. So since the approval of these CAR T-cell therapies, there are more and more patients in the real world has been receiving this kind of treatment, and which gave us an opportunity to look at the real-world response of CAR T-cell therapies in comparison to patients' response on clinical trial, because typically patients on clinical trials, they are selected population, and sometimes we might not be able to see a similar response rate. And to our pleasant surprise, you can see highlighted in green here is, in the real-world experience, patients treated with CAR T-cell therapies using CD19 CAR T-cells, they are actually sicker than patients who were enrolled on clinical trials. You can see more than half of them otherwise would not be eligible for ZUMA-1 clinical trials. But nevertheless, these patients have a very similar response rate to the CAR T-cell therapies. Somewhere around half of the patients achieve complete remission, and the remission seems to be durable. And here is a patients that were treated on ZUMA-1. This was back in 2016. So this is the patient with multiple prior lines of treatment, including prior autologous stem cell transplant. And he had multiple lymph node involvement with lymphoma prior to ZUMA-1 CAR T-cell therapy. And 6 weeks later, he entered into a complete remission, and the patient continued to stay in remission. He actually started to run marathons. And we don't know whether he's cured, but since the remission is already more than 3.5 years, we're hoping that the lymphoma will never come back. And this is a second case of a patient who received Yescarta as the commercial indication. And this is a patient prior to treatment also had multiple lines of prior therapies. The patient had what we call very high-grade lymphoma, never able to achieve a remission. She would get into remission, but quickly would relapse. So prior to CAR T-cell infusions, she has lymphoma nodules in the pelvis and also lymphoma in the thigh. And 4 weeks after the treatment, she entered into a complete remission, and the patient also continued to stay in remission. So what's next now for our CD19 CAR T-cell trials treatment? Can we use it for other lymphomas? And the answer is yes. So there are multiple clinical trials are really looking at using CD19 CAR Ts for patients with lymphoma other than diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. For example, for follicular lymphoma, ZUMA-2 is the study that's the most advanced. It has already completed accrual 80 patients, and we're still waiting for the final results, but the prediction is most likely early next year, we'll have the CAR T-cell therapy FDA approved for mantle cell lymphoma patients who disease progress after ibrutinib BTK inhibitor treatment. And recently, Transcend study also reported their experience in treating patients with mantle cell lymphoma. 9 out of 17 patients achieved a complete remission. And for patients with lymphoma in the brain, and these are the patients who were excluded from prior studies using CD19 CAR Ts in the pivotal clinical trials. But if you look at patients who enroll on the lysosel studies, 4 out of 9 patients achieved complete remission. And at CETA Hope, we also have a clinical trial using CD19 CAR T specifically for patients either with metastatic secondary CNS lymphoma or primary CNS lymphoma, and we have seen quite a few good responders, and this result will be reported at ASH at the end of this year. And for patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, these leukemia cells also have CD20 expressed on the surface. There's this Transcend CRL004 studies, which have shown that CAR Ts can also be quite effective for these populations. 10 out of 22 patients responded with a complete response rate of 46%. And for indolent lymphoma, there are multiple clinical trials have treated such patients. From the experience from JCAR014, that study was done in Seattle, 88% of response rate, so 7 out of 8 patients went into a complete remission. And at UPenn, 10 out of 14 patients went into complete remission using CD19 CAR. And currently, there are 2 pivotal trials ongoing for follicular lymphoma. One is the ZUMA-5, which is active ongoing. The other one is Belinda, which is using T-cell cells. The studies, we don't have the report yet. And other than CD19s, there are also other CAR Ts for lymphomas in clinical trials. So in the clinic, other than CD19s, there are CD20 CARs. There are also bispecific CAR. So CARs recognizing both CD19 and CD22, or CARs recognizing CD19 and the CD20. And there's also RO1 CAR, which expresses on mantle cell lymphoma and also on lung cancer cells. And for T-cell lymphomas, there are also, this list is actually getting longer. There are CARs recognizing CD4. So most of the T-cell lymphoma cells actually are CD4 T cells. So a CAR recognizing CD4 potentially could be beneficial for most patients with T-cell lymphoma. And CD5 CAR has been ongoing at Baylor College of Medicine. I just came back from the IW CAR T workshop last week, and there are several complete remissions after treatment with CD5 CAR. And there are, of course, CARs targeting CD30, which is the same target for brentuximab. And this CAR now currently is being tested for patients with T-cell lymphoma and also patients with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there are multiple CAR Ts being evaluated in the preclinical settings and getting into the clinical trials. But we have to remember that CAR T-cell therapy is not trivial. It comes with quite a bit of complications. Depends on the target. You can have what we call on-target but off-tumor side effects. If the target expresses on normal tissues, then giving patient CAR T-cell therapies can cause damage to the normal tissue. In the setting of CD19s, the bystander the side effect is the B-cell aplasia, because normal B-cell also express CD19. And you can have lymphodepletion-related toxicities. And there are 2 CAR T-cell therapy-related toxicities. The one is cytokine release syndrome, and the other one is the neurologic toxicities. And cytokine release syndrome is actually quite closely mimicking what an infection could be, and the hallmark is fever. The patient can have pretty high fever for days without positive blood culture, and this patient can also have low blood pressure and can have low oxygen. And here is here's a look at the second release syndrome and neurologic toxicities in the 3 multi-center phase 2 studies using CD19 for lymphoma. As you can see that the second release syndromes in severe form, what we call grade 3 and above, it's in quite a number of patients. The same with neurologic toxicities. And here is a patient example of the second release syndromes. Now, this patient who receives CAR T-cell infusion at day 0 and spike of fever the next day on day 1 and was spiking fever every day, from day 1 to day 5. And she received tocilizumab, which is a IL-6 receptor blocker, which really brings down the fever, but the patient developed hypotension and requiring intubation. And with medical support, she actually made a full recovery. She was extubated on day 10, and all the side effects actually were reversible. And she went on and had a complete remission. And here's one of my patients just to show you neurologic toxicities. Neurologic toxicity can present many different forms, and one of the easiest way to do is nowadays this is standard City Hope is every day after the CAR T infusion they have to write a sentence, and this patient decided to write the sentence. Teresa, that's his wife. Teresa and I love Jesus. So day 0 you can see how clear the handwriting is. But day 3, we start to see the problem. This actually preceded to any physical presentations. And it really took him 4 weeks until day 28, if you look at the handwritings, for him to recover to a somewhat normalcy. And he spent the entire 4 weeks in the hospital because of neurologic toxicities. So it's not a treatment that can be given in any place. It has to be given in a place with specialized immunotherapy capacity, has the right infrastructure to monitor and manage the side effects. And infection is another big complications. You can see from the study from the Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and from the study that led to Kymriah approval and Yescarta approvals. The infection rate can range from 30 to 50%. And severe ones range from 14 to 33%. So a third of patients can have pretty severe infections. And there are also patients who are succumbed to the treatment due to fatal infection. So definitely, infectious disease prophylaxis is recommended, and we typically will have infectious disease physician on board if the patient gets pretty severe infection. So the next is what are the challenges? So this is actually a picture taken from outside of 4th grade classroom. It says that even superheroes need to do their homework. So we need to learn. Now, what are the deficiencies? How to make our CAR T cells more available for patients? For example, the patient have very rapidly progressing disease. Now, there's not enough time with the current CAR T treatment to really provide the CAR T on time. And for these patients, we really need to work on how to make the CAR T product. Nowadays, 17 to 22 days. Can we shorten that duration to 1 week, to just a few days? Or can we look into getting some sort of off-the-shelf product, which is using the good, healthy immune cells from a donor and made a CAR T product, what we call the allogeneic CAR T products, and for those patients. So once the patient, if there's a need, then we can get the product and give it to the patient right away. We don't need to go from collecting the leukapheresis product and to make the CAR T to make the CAR T products at the end. So there are multiple clinical trials. For example, looking at core blood-derived NK cells using transducing with CD19 CAR T. So those are the third-party CAR Ts. And there are also different ways using third-party healthy donor T cells to make CD19 CAR T cell. For example, the PP-CD19 CAR and the UCAR, which is using the TALEN technology to knocking CD19 into healthy donor T cells. So these are all third-party T cells, not from the patient themselves. And it's still early on at this stage. We don't really know the efficacy yet. We don't know how long you need this cell to be in your body to get a durable response. But several initial report of those studies will come out at the end of the year. And we also need to design a treatment that can give it to patients who has what we call a poor performance status because of comorbidities, and patients who don't have enough reserve to be able to cope with like a grade 2 cytokine release syndromes or have neurologic toxicities. So this requires on the research side for us to design novel CAR Ts that can give you a similar efficacy, but at the same time, it will give you much less toxicities. Now, there are ways now we have found out that this could be possible. So one study in the clinical trial is the Autolus trial, which is a CD19 CAR, CD19 and CD22 CAR, but there's mutation introduced into this activation domain, so the intracellular part of the CAR, and which made the CAR remain its potency, but the CAR will secrete much less cytokines, cause much less immune response. And there are also ways to optimize manufacturing platform. So the same CAR, but how you make the T cells outside the body is also critical to cause activities and these related toxicities. And we are also learning how to manage cytokine release syndromes and patients with neurologic toxicities. So in ZUMA-1 study, the new cohort was actually opened. We asked the question, can we give prophylactic corticosteroids? Will that help to mitigate the cytokine release syndromes or neurologic toxicities? The patient will be less sicker and have, but at the same time, there's an efficacy. And newer drugs are being tested in the clinic to see whether they can help us to really to mitigate these toxicities. For example, anakinra, which is an IL-1 receptor blocker, and dasatinib, which can help to switch on and off the CAR T cells inside the patient. And there are other challenges is how to, so for patients who initially respond to CAR Ts and relapse, or patients who do not respond to CAR T cells, what do we do? And here is a patient, you can see prior to the CAR T cell treatment, the patient have a lot of the heart area inside the abdomen, a lot of lymphoma volume. And this patient actually went into a complete remission around day 40. We actually did a random biopsy around there's a spot or in the gut. There was no evidence of lymphoma. Unfortunately, 6 months later, the lymphoma recurred. And here's another patient. Before the CAR T cell treatment, had some lymph node involvement, but has a very sizable lymphoma involving the right lung. And 4 weeks after the CAR T cell treatment using CD19 CAR Ts, there's really no change of this lymphoma in the lungs. And with the biopsy, it's still lymphoma cells. So for these patients, what should we do? So there are a lot of ways trying to really understand the resistant mechanisms. Could it be because the T cells, they are just when we collect them, they are dysregulated, they are not optimal, so therefore you cannot make a very good T cell product. So how to make a fit T cell product? Ways we could do is we could put a cytokine, a growth factor, inside the CAR T cell. So when the T cell works, at the same time they also secrete growth factor to feed into themselves, so that they have better proliferation inside the patient. And we can also, in patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, it has been found that if they have ibrutinib treatment for 5 cycles, even really ibrutinib exposure will convert their T cell from very immunosuppressive to potent T cells. And then you can make a good CAR T product. And there are also ways to combine the CAR T cells together with an immune modulator and combine the CAR T cells with an immune booster, such as a 4-1BB agonist that's currently ongoing in ZUMA-11 clinical trial. And there are ways to modulate the microenvironment, to change the hostile tumor environment and make them more susceptible to CAR T treatment. This is bringing the PD1, PD1 blockade, which will have dual role. One is to make the T cell more potent, and the other is really to block the inhibitory signal that stems from the tumors to the lymphoma. And let me just go back one. Yeah, and also by sampling patients' recurrent tumor, what we have learned is that when the lymphoma recurs, sometimes what we found is those lymphoma, they no longer have CD19 expressed on the surface. As we talked about earlier, these lymphoma cells, they can evolve. When there's a selection pressure, they will try to get around the selection, and they become CD19 negative, or they downregulate the CD19 expression to below the threshold that the CAR T can see them, or they specifically just lose the detection point that can be sensed by the CD19 CAR Ts. So to get around that, there's a lot of emphasis now making dual targeting. So you target both CD19, CD20, or CD19, CD22, or CD19, BAFF-R. So you give targeting two proteins on the surface of the lymphoma, putting a lot of pressure on the lymphoma, so they won't be, so it won't be that easy for lymphoma cells to evolve to get around. And there are also, so what to do with patients at present time, if a patient had CAR T infusion, got into remission, but the lymphoma came back, or the patient just had no response to CAR T treatment, as the case I showed you earlier. So what to do at present time? So this is the case that the patient with high-grade double expressor diffuse large B-cell lymphoma had prior chemotherapy treatment, had autologous stem cell transplant, but the lymphoma came back 3 months later. After the transplant, she got CD19 CAR T treatment, went into remission around day 40, and the lymphoma came back on day 187, and we did. And we give her bispecific antibody treatment. So this is against CD20 on the surface. In this case, the patient actually went into a complete remission after bispecific CD20 treatment, and went on to autologous allogeneic stem cell transplant and has been in remission since 2017. And here is another example. This is a 69-year-old patient with double expressor diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, had prior R-CHOP treatment, had six years of remission, and the disease came back, and got treatment again, and it came back again. And the patient went on to receive the CAR T-cell therapies. You can see prior to the CAR T treatment, had a lot of lymph nodes involvement, and 38 days after the CAR T treatment, essentially when you look at the PET scan, there's no change. And we did a biopsy, we see there's still presence of lymphoma. And this is the patient, this patient was also enrolled onto the bispecific antibody clinical trial using anti-CD20, anti-CD3, targeting therapies. And bispecific is an off-the-shelf product. Basically, you can just infuse into the vein, and inside the patient's body, on one end of the product will grab the lymphoma cells because of CD20 expression, and the other end will grab the patient's T cells. So the reaction happens inside the patient. And in this patient case, after the bispecific antibody treatment, the patient went into complete remission. So the bottom line is, for any patient who did not have a good response from CAR T treatment, this patient should really be on clinical trials. So there are clinical trials now designed and allow specifically for patient post-CAR T failure. So just to conclude my talk, we think that right now the CAR T-cell therapies has really been getting more and more excitement in treating patients with different kinds of lymphomas, including B-cell lymphomas and T-cell lymphomas as well. But we need to keep in mind that it's not easy. It really requires a dedicated team to manage these patients because of the unique and serious toxicities. And our management of these patients, really, the goal is really how to deliver CAR T in a safe way, and how to deliver CAR T to give patients realistic hope, and also how to deliver CAR T up to the regulatory standard. And there are more and more clinical trials ongoing right now. We'll expect there will be more CAR Ts will be approved for patients with lymphoma. And then comes the other toxicity, what we call the financial toxicities, which I don't have time to talk about today, but that's a realistic problems, and how to expand CAR T-cell therapies for patients who need it, regardless of their insurance status, their socioeconomic status. And last, I would like to encourage patients, if you can spread the word, we really need patients to participate in clinical trials that will give you the exposure to the novel treatment, and at the same time, you will also help us understand why the trial works and why it doesn't work. It helps us to design better and smarter the next line of treatment. And also, please participate in research studies in all different forms. And that's how we really made the field forward, and how we made all the lymphoma treatments have all really gone through, even rituximab gone through the early stage of clinical trials and becoming a standard of care. And last but not the least is really thank you all. And I would like to actually dedicate this presentation to my late mentor. Picture showed is here, Dr. Oliver Press, who used to be the scientific advisory board chairman for Lymphoma Research Foundation. He was actually the person who really taught me all about how to do CAR T-cell therapies, how to design CAR Ts in the laboratory. He himself succumbed to cancer in 2017. And this talk is also dedicated to those patients who were part of the fight for lymphoma, but they're no longer here to be with us. But I think their spirits continues to influence how we work and how we really carry this on further on and really try to provide a cure for lymphoma. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for watching this Ed Forum chat on immunotherapy as a treatment option for lymphoma. Resources are there available for patients?
Well, we have a variety of resources for patients and caregivers, specifically on immunotherapy and CAR T-cell therapy, including print publications such as our fact sheets and our disease-specific guides as well, which include information on both treatment types. We also have digital resources, including our website, which is a great resource for anybody, videos on YouTube, as well as our CAR T animation video, which we're very excited about, that I think explains the process very clearly.
Awesome. And so if people want to find out some of those fact sheets, where can they go to look them up? Who do they call? How do they reach out?
So they can either check our website out at lymphoma.org, or they can call our LRF helpline at 1-800-500-9976, or email us at helpline@lymphoma.org.
Awesome. Victor, thanks so much for being with us. And make sure you stay tuned throughout the day. We're going to have more chats from the 2019 LRF Ed Forum from Chicago, Illinois. Thanks for watching, everybody. Talk to you later.